Kill the Indian, save the man was the premise for which the boarding schools were established. Near the end of the 1800s, there was this movement in the United States that lasted up until the 60s and 70s, 1960 and 1970, called the Indian boarding schools. And the whole idea was kill the Indian, save the man. If you kill everything that's Indian in that person, by taking them away from their family, taking them away from their village, taking them away from their language, taking them away from everything that you all know individually, that they could assimilate them into the population, the dominant society, what I call the dominant society. And this man by the name of Colonel Pratt was in Pennsylvania, and there was this old military establishment there. And he came up with this great idea of killing the Indian and saving the man by creating a military-style boarding school.
The government would go in and they would take these children involuntarily from their parents, from their families, and in theory, they could go home. Well, we're supposed to be able to.
My grandmother, when she went to boarding school, lived up in Waganakasing, right? Well, they had a boarding school there. Why didn't they let her go to that boarding school? Because she'd be near her family and she could run away, and they transferred her down to Mount Pleasant Indian School.
The parents have their kids taken away. The kids are completely away from their families. They were often taken to boarding schools that were far away from the reservation that they were living at. So it was, even if they had like a break, they couldn't, there's no way they could make it back home. And no way that the families could make it to visit them. And this was all done on purpose, of course.
The other part of it too is it's traumatic enough for a child to be taken away involuntarily from their family, but to be taken away and then not have any contact with their family. And while in paper, in writing, to cover their rear ends, the federal government said in there, oh, we encourage the parents to come and get them during the summer. But in the summer was when they made a lot of money off the kids, because the kids would have to work farms, they get no pay, they could work all these menial jobs to make money. They would not dry clean, but they would wash and press clothes and stuff, and then, you know, they bring it in, they get money.
Native American children were forced to go to the boarding schools in order to assimilate them into white culture.
They were not allowed to speak the language. They were not allowed to practice any of their religious ways. They had no privacy.
The loss of language, there's a huge generation gap where many don't know their language, and language is one of the main parts of culture, and you can learn a lot from just the language itself.
They wasn't able to speak it at all, and if they spoke it, they were beaten. Some children, one they mentioned a student, he had like spoken his native language and was kicked down the stairs, was severely beaten, and after that happened, they never saw him again around school. And so whether he was sent home, whether he was killed and taken out to the cemetery in the back, the students had no idea. But you know, when you see that happen, it scared several of them, you know, to see fellow classmates, or even possibly ones from their home area, to be beaten and the things that they went through.
And the worst story I want to tell you about is a woman I interviewed out west. She tells me this story. She used to work in the kitchen at the boarding school. And one day, and a lot of these boarding schools, by the way, were run by the Catholic Church. And so the priest and the sisters watched over the kids and stuff. And she said one day she's working in the kitchen and she was making bread and everything, and they brought this beautiful little Indian baby down, you know, just little blue outfit and such, and everybody, you know, they were trying to find out who it was, and it was one of the Indian young Indian girls that had been impregnated by the priest who was overseeing the school. The next day, she thought something was quite weird because they brought the baby down that time, but they had it wrapped up. And she just happened to go into the storage room where the big furnace was, and two sisters and the priest were throwing the baby alive into the stove. And she could hear the baby scream. A lot of that stuff went on. They buried lots of kids. They sexually molested lots of kids. They would have kids sexually molest each other, and all these things that have just caused tremendous amount of multi-generational trauma in the Indian communities. I mean, just terrible things went on, and it wasn't, we've had people across the entire country, and it did not make a difference. Whether they were in the state of Washington, or in Maryland, or Michigan, or Minnesota, or New Mexico, the same stories came out. These folks weren't able to travel and communicate like we do today. So how did those same exact stories all come out of those places? Because they were done in all those places. Eyewitnesses, some of which have passed on now. But we have documented, interviews with them and such.
My name is Andrew Windy Boy. I'm a Chippewa Cree. I did 2 boarding schools, one in Wahpeton Indian School in Wahpeton, North Dakota, and the other one is Flandreau Indian School in Flandreau, South Dakota. Mid-60s to early 70s took me to the boarding school where I wasn't allowed to talk my native tongue or practice my native ways. Numerous times they'd put on this big huge white cone, put on there, it says dunce. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know English. They put it on me, make me wear it all over. Kids would laugh at me. They took me away from all of that and punished me for talking that. It was my first language. I didn't know any other language. So whenever I talk, it came out. Cree would come out, and whenever I talk, I get hit. I got hit so much I lost my tongue. I lost my native tongue. The only thing I remember was my Indian name. Which is Xenukihu, means old man eagle. That's the only Cree I knew. They beat me. Every day, they beat me. They cut off my hair, made me kneel in front of the door where everybody come in. Everybody make fun of me when they come by me, rub my head and laugh at me because I was talking. They caught me talking. I hope someday somebody will hear me. I hope nobody has to go through this. We have to have our own language. Because what we do when we talk to our spirits, they don't understand English. They look at you, you'll be talking in English. What are you saying? Nobody's saying that in Cree. Like, no, you didn't know what I just said. That was a hard time in my life. I'll always remember it. For that white man, it's a terrible shame for him to be treating people like this. Because we are a people. We just need to be accepted.
That loss of culture just impacted each generation of families after that. A lot of the people that we talked to in Mount Pleasant on the reservation are still like, really, they almost lost their language because of the boarding schools.
I've been working. I worked in a tribal school run by the tribe, and I have seen more abuse in my family and in the Indian communities that I've been in across this country. And a lot of it is because, for number one, when those kids were all taken away from their moms, those moms didn't know how to be moms because they had no children to be mothers to. Dads didn't know how to be dads. And then we have the whole thing of poverty, depression, feeling like a second-class citizen, being called names, all those different things that happened in the boarding schools. A lot of suicide. They didn't want to think about not going home, so they killed themselves. They missed their family so much they killed themselves. And this was like, some of them were like in the 3rd grade or even younger, and they're from the 3rd grade to the 12th grade. Well, by that time, they were so brainwashed, if they did go home, they didn't know how to speak the language, they didn't know any of the traditions anymore, or any of that. Okay, so it was a real dichotomy for them. They couldn't understand what was happening. And then the reason I have a lot of research that I've done, but there's a lot of stuff that was never written down or reported because the people that worked in the boarding schools, from the churches, and the people that ran the boarding schools, they didn't know how to translate the language. They beat the hell out of the kids for saying the language, but then if they would talk to the parents and they'd talk in the language, there was all kinds of communication problems. I truly believe the difference between one culture and another culture is a language. And they took our language away from us for almost 2 generations. It's really hard to get it back now. And I'm not fluent. I can speak a little of my language, but not much.
Out at the Mount Pleasant School, there's 5 willow trees around the front of it, and there's a fountain, and they surround it. And when you look at them, you know, trees may have a knot or two in them, but these 5 willow trees are just loaded with knots all over them. And if you just look at them, okay, they're knots in a tree. But if you look closely at them, and the story is that when students had died, well, when somebody died at the school, that's where their spirits went to, is to the trees. And when you look at them, you can see faces in them, or you can see, different parts, maybe. And one, you see a feather, and, a girl actually standing. It's towards the bottom of the trunk, but it's there. And just all the faces that you can see out there in different areas. You may see a bear. So it just depends on how you look at it, if you have the open mind enough,
And there's just now like a revival, especially among the youth, coming together to kind of reclaim their culture, reclaim their language. They've reclaimed a lot of the art, especially basket making, anything with beads, feathers, all of that. So they've been reclaiming those traditions as well, reclaiming their language, especially among the youth. And it's really cool to see everybody get involved. So the elders trying to pass on their knowledge. The children are really hungry to learn and to reclaim their culture. And then, of course, everybody else is all for it as well. So it was really cool. When we went to the Spirit Feast as well, there was a surprising amount of children, and they were in traditional dress, some of them. So, yeah, it's cool to see everybody doing their part in trying to make up for lost time.
Has anybody ever read about any of this before in high school in their history books or anything? Okay. It's one of the nation's best kept secret. And as educational institutions, and I spent 25 years in them, you all have the right to know. That's why we're here. And who writes the textbooks? The dominant society. Who writes the textbooks? The victors, the conquerors, okay? That's who writes them. We used to have a saying, if you've ever been in a meeting, that whoever takes the notes at the meeting created what happened at that meeting, and maybe that's not even what happened. Maybe that person left something out or whatever. Well, a lot of that stuff was left out when it comes to Native Americans, and you're right to know what really happened.
In the past, do you think that getting the word out to these students will change?
I'm hopeful. I truly believe what I said about not blaming them, because they didn't themselves do the things that caused all the atrocities in the boarding schools. But what I want them to know is I want them to know the other society, other part of the situation. I want them to know the other side of the story. I want them to know that there is another side of the story. I want them to be able to be free thinkers and critical thinkers. I want them to have the information they need to make a decision about something. But I don't blame them. Like I said, I can forgive what happened, but I never have to forget what happened.